There are lots of great things going on at the University of Louisville in research, academics, what students are doing, and we talk about all those kinds of things on this show. This is UofL Today with Mark Hebert on Talk Radio 1080, WKJK, and iHeartMedia. So what are we going to talk about on the show today? Well, the United States has a stunningly high rate of women, especially African-American women, who die during or shortly after childbirth. A UofL nursing professor says the majority of these deaths are entirely preventable, and she'll be here to talk about it. Also, have you ever heard of night blindness? Well, it is a thing. And a UofL researcher is on the path to being able to restore night vision for people. We'll talk to him about his research. But first, it's been 50 years since that unbelievable date when we put a man on the moon. Landing on the moon. Tom Tretter is a professor at UofL and a director of the Rauch Planetarium on UofL's campus, and he's here to talk about one of the biggest dates in United States history. Tom, good to see you.
Thank you, Mark. Good to be here.
All right. Well, Saturday was the official date of the 50th anniversary of putting a man on the moon. Where were you?
Well, I was 5 years old, so I was playing with my Lincoln Logs. I remember this, actually. And my parents had the TV on, like a lot of people did around the world, frankly. And I was too bothered to not watch TV. I just played my Lincoln Logs. I wasn't that interested.
So you weren't paying any attention
I really
at all.
wasn't, no.
And here you are now, the big space guy, right?
That's right.
Yeah, I was, we were on vacation. I remember sitting in a hotel room. I don't remember where we were with my brother and my parents watching that on TV. So,
yeah, the most watched show at that point in time in television history.
A lot of people remember where they were and where they were watching. What's the big deal 50 years later? Is it still a big deal that we had a man on the moon?
I think it really is, because we've got a space program that really, after that man on the moon missions in the 60s and 70s, we shifted to automated spacecraft, robotic spacecraft. And I think the sentiment is shifting back to having humans in space, because we can do so much more with people that are much more flexible than a robot would be.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think that is? Why do you think that the sentiment is shifting back to wanting to put people in space? And I've got some polling numbers here I'm going to throw at you here in a minute, but why do you think that is?
So, well, I think it's just the humanness of the endeavor, right? So when you have people in space, we can imagine ourselves there. We can imagine our ancestors maybe, and then our descendants going into space. And in some sense, that might be the future of human race, right? Leaving this one little planet that we're on and eventually colonizing other parts of our solar system.
Mm-hmm. When you talk to folks at the planetarium and you mingle with younger folks, do they have any concept of what it was like 50 years ago when we put a person on the moon, and why it was such a big deal at the time?
Right. Yeah, that's a very good question. The basic answer is no, they don't, because our younger folks today take a lot of things for granted that in the 1960s, when this was being done, were completely unknown technologies, unknown paths, unknown processes. And so things that our folks take for granted today seem easy, but at the time in the 1960s, when the mission was being planned, we didn't have computers that were smaller than a room, for example. Mm-hmm. We had no way to know what the moon's surface was like, whether the dust would be like quicksand-like and swallow the spacecraft. There's so many things we didn't know that now everybody can look up on the internet and we know what it's like. And it's taken for granted by those who haven't lived through those times.
Yeah, we're talking with Tom Tretter, who's the director of the Rauch Planetarium on UofL's campus, and we're talking about 50 years ago this month when we put a man on the moon. And when you talk to these folks as well, I mean, we have that technology now, obviously. Are they so wallowing in what they can look at on YouTube and see, illustrations, and these people are doing wild things in space? We're sending private entrepreneurs or going into space these days. Are they just thinking, what's the big deal? I don't know. It seems like, everybody can do it. It's on YouTube, right?
Yeah, well, it is on YouTube, right? So we send, cars into space now, apparently. So I think most people, though, most young folks included, are still fascinated by the idea of traveling to space and living in space. And so even though it seems old hat in some ways, there's still a lot of energy and enthusiasm. As a professor of education, I work with young people all the time and their teachers, and I'm encouraged by the energy and enthusiasm that our young folks have for space. I mean, they're not jaded, they're interested. So that's really nice to see.
And I told you I had some numbers that I was going to throw at you. There were some numbers on, I think there was a poll, I think it was last year, asking folks, about their, did they really want to go into space? Mm-hmm. What were their main interests if we do go into space? Do they want to go to Mars or whatever? 80% said that the space station, 80% of Americans said the space station is very important, and going into space was important, about 72%. But they said no interest in going to the moon. I think it was 13% said they were interested in going to the moon again. And it wasn't that many more. I think it was 18% that said, yeah, let's send somebody to Mars. So, that's what NASA is looking at now, is potentially sending somebody to Mars. But the American public is saying, nah, we've got some other interests. We're interested in going to space, but not necessarily going to Mars. So how do you reconcile that, from the American public perspective?
Yeah, I think
just the cost, maybe.
I think the cost, but I also think time frame, right? So any of these missions, the moon or Mars in particular, are such a long time frame. People have a hard time getting their heads around it. So the enthusiasm for an event might be there, but the enthusiasm for a 10-year sort of mission is maybe less so. It just feels too hard to get your head around.
Yeah. I guess that could be. And the top priority of folks who wanted to see us go back into space and stay in space, and NASA to be a relevant structure of the U.S. government, 63%, it was to monitor Earth's climate. They said that was their number one priority. We want you up there monitoring the climate. The second, say at 62%, was to monitor asteroids and other objects that might hit the Earth. So I thought that was really interesting, though, that people have an interest. Hey, if we're going up in space, let's look and make sure that nothing's going to hit us.
Right.
And number two, keep tabs on the changing climate.
Yeah, I think that's actually very wise, frankly. I mean, we know much more about our planet than we ever did, thanks in large part to our space assets, our satellites and our missions out there. So I think people are very aware of that, and I think they realize the value of that. I mean, we know when hurricanes are coming now. We take it for granted. We can almost to the hour predict when a hurricane's going to hit, for example. Those are the sorts of things that we did not know. You go back in time a little bit, and we didn't even have that data. We didn't know what to look for. So I think people recognize that, and I think they see the personal value of that as well as the societal value. I think that's much more sort of directly accessible to people. So that makes a lot of sense to me, that they're going to be interested in us continuing to do that kind of work.
We're talking to Tom Tretter, who's the director of the Rauch Planetarium at UofL, and he's also a professor in the College of Education at UofL. And we're talking about the space mission 50 years ago, and I guess what's to come. From your perspective, you guys that are the geeks and and astronomy and work at planetariums and those kinds of things, what do you see for the next, say, 20 years in space travel and exploration? Is it all going to go, do you think, to private investors who are building these multi-billion-dollar rockets and only billionaires are going into space? Or do you think that there's still going to be that scientific discovery aspect of it out there?
I think both will continue to happen. I think the privatization of space is going to really start to ramp up. We're seeing a little bit of that now with various companies starting their own businesses around that. The one thing that will open that up a lot is oddly enough, an old law that essentially was an agreement between the major nations of the Earth that space cannot be privatized, essentially back in the 1960s when we started going out there. So companies that are interested in asteroid mining, for example, which is a big area that a lot of people don't think about, that's actually of high interest to many companies to try to figure out the way to mine some of these asteroids that are out there, including those near-Earth ones that you mentioned that might hit the Earth eventually, right? So there's a lot of value there that's already out of the gravity well of Earth, so you don't have to launch it into space. It's already up there. But the question is who can own that, because the international law says right now it's murky on that point. And so companies hesitant to invest billions of dollars if they don't know for sure if they can actually own what they work towards.
And I assume you're talking about ore that is in asteroids, isn't it? I guess. Isn't that the mineral that's in?
That is one of the minerals. Yeah, that's one of the core minerals. The other things that are simple, I guess simple, there's sort of common things like water. Water is a high-value commodity in space. You need it to drink. You need it to live. We also break water apart into hydrogen, oxygen. It becomes fuel. So there are water-based resources that we could use for things like spaceships or permanent colonies, and then the ore, and there's some very rare precious metals. As we run out of precious metals on Earth, some of the rare earth elements that we have, every cell phone has a little bit of rare earth elements in it, and that's a limited resource here on Earth.
All right, before I let you go, I'm going to let you make a pitch for the planetarium. What have you got coming up in terms of programs at the planetarium, and what do you got going on this summer?
Certainly, we have a number of things always going on at the planetarium. Check our website, louisville.edu/planetarium. We have programming every Friday and Saturday. We have the cultural pass for those who are participating in that. They can come free this summer. We have a number of summer camps going on, and we also have workshops for kids of all ages at different times throughout the year. So we try to engage all parts of our community in ways that they would find directly relevant. So come on out. There's always something interesting. Every month we do a Skies Over Louisville tour of our night skies. You can see what's in our sky, how to find it, and even get some hints and telescope advice.
All right, interesting stuff at the planetarium. Tom, always good to see you. Hundreds of women die in the United States each year during childbirth or shortly thereafter. Cindi Logsdon is a professor in the UofL School of Nursing, and she's taken a look at the troubling maternal mortality rate in the U.S. and maybe what can be done about it. Cindi, it's good to have you on the program again.
Thank you so much.
You're a frequent visitor here, and we appreciate you coming on the show. Mortality, maternal mortality, what is it? How do you describe that to people who say, what does that mean?
So about 700 women die in the first year after birth from childbearing-related complications. That could be complications that happen when they're in the hospital, or after birth until the baby is a year old. This is a very troubling statistic, and we are on the same level as countries that are very low resource.
Like who? Like what?
Like countries in Africa, for
really?
example.
So we have as many women. Our rate is
in some countries in Africa.
Wow.
Yeah, it just is a very troubling statistic. And not only is it maternal mortality, but thousands and thousands of more women suffer from what is called severe maternal morbidity, which they don't actually die but are severely ill with complications, both chronic diseases, complications of pregnancy, complications of childbirth, during pregnancy, during delivery, but then after and during that first year too. And so this is a very troubling statistic. The CDC released this very thorough report on Mother's Day to the nation to give these statistics and detailed statistics. And the interesting thing that they included in this specific report is the days after birth and some of the specific diagnoses that women were most commonly dying from. And they're just a range of cardiac diseases for the most
the
part.
Heart?
Some cardiovascular, some sorts
Really?
of things. So blood pressure related, heart sort of issues, but they would be indicative of long-term chronic health issues. And some of them are related to family history, some are related to just lifestyle sorts of factors, some are related to not having appropriate health promotion and health care from providers over the course of their lifetime. There's a real, I should point out, there's a real emphasis on the impact of health disparities on this very important issue, and particularly African American women are dying and suffering from this severe maternal morbidity 3 times the rate of white women.
And the morbidity meaning that that they just got really sick. They didn't
Right.
die, but they got really sick. So how many women are we talking about? If we've got 700 women that die after having babies each year, how many women are suffering some serious health issues?
I mean, many thousands, and so that number is not quite as specific and able to pinpoint that down, because we can look at death certificates for a number of people that die in the cause of death. So it's a little more of a general estimate for the morbidity, but many thousands of women.
And when you're talking about that, we've talked about it on a national scale. Any idea where Kentucky fits in here, and whether Kentucky's like one of the worst states for mortality from women that just had babies, or are we middle of the pack? Where are we?
Well, this is very interesting. We have made great strides in getting a handle on the issue in Kentucky under the leadership of Dr. Connie White, who's Deputy Director of Health in Kentucky. And she and some other leaders in the state have spearheaded some efforts to create, in the fall of 2018, the first report of maternal mortality in Kentucky. So we do know that we fit about midway in all of the states. We're not the worst. We're not the best.
Good. That's good. We're not the worst.
But the interesting thing that report gave us data on is that half of our women that die, half of our new mothers that die, have a problem related to addiction.
Drugs.
So half of them are related to addiction. And of course, that's very disturbing, and there are many processes that are in place and starting to be put in place to provide comprehensive services for women with addiction, but certainly not as many as we need.
Is that different in Kentucky, that half the women are dying from drug overdoses or drug complications, as opposed to, say, Indiana or New York or someplace like that?
I don't know the percentage of comparing Kentucky to specific states, but I know that it's a widespread problem. And, the only state that I've data on is Kentucky. Interestingly, in this community, we can be so proud of this one program that the Volunteers of America is doing under the leader of Jennifer Hancock for the care of mothers with addiction. But that's only one program. We have really tried to make efforts in Kentucky with having programs to deal with the issue and provide support and care to mothers and families, but certainly not as many as we'd like to have.
Again, we're talking with Cindi Logsdon, who's a professor in the UofL School of Nursing and also works in the Office of the Executive Vice President for Research and Innovation at the University of Louisville. And she's been looking at the troubling maternal mortality rate in the United States and how we might do some things to turn that around a little bit. So what can be done? You mentioned the one program here in Louisville.
Right.
What are some things that are being done to perhaps spot these women that come in pregnant, have babies, and are potentially going to die or get seriously ill? How do you identify them?
So people are looking at some comprehensive approaches to this to provide services to women from the time they leave the hospital for the first year after childbirth. What approach can we use so that women get comprehensive assessment, are following comprehensively to monitor their symptoms, to get them into services that they need, to have a flag for when a symptom comes up that means they immediately need to be seen. So I am part of a team that's working on that. Other people are also working on that. Dr. White has a perinatal quality conference that she is spearheading for the fall so that a number of people in Kentucky are looking at that. The chair of OBGYN at UofL, Dr. Francis, is part of a group working with me to even examine how we might consider new models of women care across the first year after birth, and that's something the American College of OBGYN is advocating too.
So you've got some folks at UofL in nursing, gynecology, other obstetrics, I'm assuming, some
Yes.
other places that are working together on this issue.
Social work, engineering,
Engineering?
public health, and School of Medicine.
How would
there are a
engineering
group of
work
us.
on this?
Well, so my colleague in engineering, Dr. Nazaru, is an expert in data mining and looking at data. And so she is part of this team to help look at systems to look at how we might use data to predict the risk for women. So that's a long-term project that we have in mind, but that's an approach we're bringing to the table. And we're so lucky to have her.
Yeah.
She brings a unique contribution.
Do you think that people out there and women who are giving birth have any clue about the rate of death among new mothers in the United States and how bad it is compared to other nations?
I do not think they have a clue, and so we published a research study, which I've talked to you about before, actually, Mark, in which we surveyed 122 women who were on the postpartum unit at the University of Louisville Hospital, and we asked them about symptoms that would indicate that they would need to monitor because they would be at risk after hospital discharge. And they only knew about half the symptoms. They didn't know who they should tell if they did have one of these symptoms, and they didn't know how long they should monitor themselves for these symptoms. You know, women and families are so focused on taking care of the baby and adjustments in their life when they go home that not enough of attention is paid on the particular symptoms that the mother needs to also monitor to stay healthy and promote her own health.
Not paying enough attention to themselves. And you're continuing your work in this area, right?
Yep, I am.
All right, so maybe we'll have you back on, hopefully, if you get a big grant or something to talk about further research in this maternal mortality, which is, I just found it stunning that the United States is just as bad as some of these
Yes.
sub-Saharan African countries in the rate
Yes.
of women who are dying after childbirth. All right, Cindi Logsdon, always good to see you. I didn't know there was such a thing as night blindness until I read a news release about Ron Gregg and his work in this field. Ron Gregg is the chair of the Biochemistry and Molecular Department in the UofL School of Medicine. We're going to talk a little bit about night blindness and his research in that area. Ron, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Good to have you. Good to have you. What is night blindness?
So vision, like we see during the day, we have two pathways really. One is during the day, so where you see colors, you're using what are called cones. And then at night, if you turned off all the lights in your basement and had just a very dim red light, you'd eventually adapt and you'd be able to see, most of us. And you're using rods under those conditions, and we can see in very dim light. But people with night blindness can't see at all. They're completely blind because that pathway is essentially shut down. So it's like having a light switch, and that switch is turned off. And the connections between the cells that absorb the light and connect to the brain have a misconnection. Okay. And that's what my lab studies.
That's what you study. So what part of the eye is it, or the brain, that can't see at night?
So at the back of the eye, you have a thin layer of neurons, and it's called the retina. And so there's really a pathway that runs from the photoreceptor, so they absorb the light around the room that you're in, and then convert that to a signal that gets passed to another neuron, and that signal then goes to the brain. So the common forms of blindness that most people know about are glaucoma and macular degeneration, and they're different. They're often age of onset type of diseases. So congenital stationary night blindness is something that happens at birth. It's because of mutations in a number of genes, and so people can't see at night, but they can see sort of okay during the day. The big problem for most people is they have nystagmus and bad myopia, nystagmus, and also.
What's that? What is? I don't know.
So nystagmus, people's eyes don't fixate. You'll meet people, they sort of wander, yeah. And the other syndrome that occurs in conjunction with this is where you have one eye that fixates and the other one is sort of in a different direction. And so those are thought to be secondary to the actual night blindness, but they are actually often more severe for the patients than the night blindness, because obviously you can turn lights on.
Right. Are there a lot of people that have night blindness that are born with this night blindness?
No, it's relatively. We don't really know the numbers because people actually can manage pretty well without dark vision. And so we think it's probably 1 in 5 to 10,000. It could be 1 in 30,000, so it's relatively rare. Most people that have night blindness, the congenital forms, are males because there are 2 genes that are on the X chromosome, and so as males we only have 1 copy, and so if we have a mutation in that, then it doesn't work.
You're out of luck. Yeah.
You're out of luck. Yeah.
Again, we're talking with Gregg, the chair of the Biochemistry and Molecular Department in the UofL School of Medicine. We're talking about night blindness. All right, so you've done some study and some research on this issue and with mice. So what's your study and what'd you find?
So the study is essentially we identify the genes in humans from sequencing. Other colleagues in Paris actually found the gene that we studied now, and from that we made a mouse line that has the same mutation. So it has they're called knockout mice. And so this is a mouse model of human congenital stationary night blindness.
So these mice can't see in the dark?
They can't see in the dark. And mice do pretty well in the dark because they have very good noses. So they operate with their olfactory system. But we can measure it very easily. And so what we did was we wanted to know, could we put the gene that was mutated in those mice back in and restore vision, right? So that would be the goal in a patient. And so the answer was yes, which is why that paper came out.
Right. So you discovered that there was some sort of gene therapy, right? What is gene therapy, and how does it work to resolve this problem in the eye and in the brain?
Yeah, so gene therapy is used for many things. People use it in cancer and all sorts of genetic diseases. So if there's a genetic disease where there's a deficiency in a gene, then the idea with gene therapy is that you have a correct copy and you reintroduce it into the animal model or to the patient eventually so that you can cure the disease. And there are some eye diseases, Leber's congenital amaurosis, which is another sort of form of night blindness, and it has retinal degeneration where the retina actually degenerates. That's in clinical trials, and it uses the same viruses that we use. So we use a virus that carries the correct gene, and we put that into the eye, and it infects parts of the retina, and then that expresses the protein, and then the switch turns back on and it wires up.
So this isn't really a surgery then. It's
no.
So how do you get this gene, for lack of a better term, into the eye?
So what you would do in a patient, we would just inject the eye into the eye. So patients that have lots of diseases go in and get steroid injections every month or so, right? Or VEGF, some of the treatments for some of the blinding diseases. And so in this case, we would just inject some virus into the eye. It would infect the cells, and that stays long term. And so it would ideally it would correct the vision phenotype. In terms of night blindness, we probably have to inject it into very young children because we want to prevent the myopia and the strabismus, this wandering eyes. And
my son's got that strabismus he had and he had to have surgery as a kid.
Yeah, you can fix it often.
Right. Again, we're talking to Gregg, chair of the Biochemistry and Molecular Department in the UofL School of Medicine. We're talking about night blindness and the possible cure, I guess, right?
Yeah, down the road. I mean, at the moment, we can fix a mouse. A mouse is a lot easier than a human. The next step really would be to go into a large animal model.
Like pigs or something like that?
So pigs are a good model. A mouse doesn't have the really high acuity vision like we have in the center of our eye. And so you can use non-human primates. Some people are using dogs. as a model. There are a lot of night-blind dogs around that occur naturally. And then eventually, once you have safety, then in theory you could go into patients. Of course, it's a rare disease and it's not incredibly debilitating. People don't go blind with it, so we're probably a ways away from recommending patients get this.
Right. Well, how would a parent know if their child is born with night blindness? How would you ever detect it?
Yeah,
If the kid doesn't know any different,
right.
how do you know?
So it's usually very different. I have a colleague, and his anecdote is that often people do things that are annoying to a family member. For example, you turn around to back up the car and then you run over the trash can every night. And that's because when people turn around, usually in the old days especially, there wasn't backup lights, right? So you couldn't see and so you're really blind. And then eventually people go into the doctor and you can be tested. But yeah, unless you get in a fairly dark environment with like a family member and they can say they can see the outlines of things and you say, well, I don't see anything, then you don't know. It's true of people with color blindness.
Right, color blindness.
Right? They don't know they're
born with
colorblind.
it. Yeah. So, is it to the point that in your mind that people should be tested for this, or is this just not that big of a deal that people can live with it and don't worry about it?
People can live with it. I think that the side effects, the myopia, are likely the reason that people would go in to see an ophthalmologist. And if they're aware that they're having difficulty at night especially, they would do a simple test. They just put you in a dark room, they put an electrode on the eye and flash a light, and you can measure this nice signal out, just like we do in mice, and that tells you whether you have this night blindness. And at this stage, of course, there's no real treatment. They treat the strabismus, and you wear thick glasses so you can deal with myopia.
And again, assuming that this gene therapy works in larger animals, and you do human trials, what are we talking about here? How many years before you even get? I mean, because it takes forever sometimes with this research, doesn't it?
It takes forever. I think it's a low. There's not a lot of interest in trying to cure night blindness because the frequency of it is fairly rare. But it would be 10 years out at least. You have to do safety. You have to identify patients, and it's not clear that we can. How well we can correct adults. Right. A lot of these treatments that we did both adults and young mice, and the young mice recovered much better. So it may mean that we have to treat children, and of course that gets into a whole set of other problems from a gene therapy.
All right, well, Ron, Gregg, interesting stuff, interesting research. Appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you.
All right, thanks for being here. All right, that'll about do it for this edition of UofL Today with Mark Hebert, which you can hear every Monday night on Talk Radio 1080 WKJK. You can also listen to the podcast of the shows on SoundCloud or iHeartMedia, or watch the programs on Metro TV, Louisville's Government Access Channel, and KETKY throughout the week. Or you can go to UofL's YouTube channel anytime and watch the shows. Check out all the UofL news, videos, and events at UofLnews.com. Thanks for listening to UofL Today with Mark Hebert, and go Cards.